Let's talk about the science of a calorie surplus. You want to build some muscle, and you may have heard that a calorie surplus is the best way to go about that. You might also be wondering, how do you actually go into a surplus without increasing body fat by too much? Maybe it's a case that you've already been working really fucking hard to bring body fat down, so the thought of building muscle appeals to you, but maybe it appeals to you, but the idea of putting on a little bit too much body fat maybe isn't the most appealing to you. So how do you avoid this kind of perma-bulk situation where you just go on and you just eat a shit ton of food and you put on a shit ton of body fat, and yes, you may put on a fuck ton of muscle, but it kind of didn't really feel like a good experience. It certainly didn't feel like an experience you would like to repeat in the future. And maybe you think that, well, is there another way? Is there another way to think about a calorie surplus that's actually going to give me that fuck ton of muscle, but it's also going to kind of limit the amount of body fat that I put on? And is there a scientific way I can go about figuring out where that is for me? That's where we're going to be talking about all of those different things in this episode of the show. Now, the first question to probably answer is, why do you need a calorie surplus in the first place? Now, it is true, you can build muscle in a calorie deficit, at maintenance, and in a surplus. In all those three different energy balance states, you can build muscle, mainly because there are two driving factors behind building muscle. One is training. Training is the absolute most paramount importance when it comes to building muscle. If you're not training correctly, you're not overloading muscles, you are not progressing in that fashion, creating enough stimulus for your muscles to then adapt and grow and change, the nutrition side of things just doesn't matter. It's just not going to have any impact whatsoever. So you need to make sure that training element is a fundamental. That's the start point. That is number one priority. After that, you're going to be thinking about protein intake. So as I've said before on previous episodes of the show, you're thinking about not only just total protein intake, i.e. your 1.8 to 2.7 grams per kilo, but you're also looking at protein frequency, because you want to be stimulating muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. The optimal way to do that is 4 to 6 servings throughout the day. That's kind of the most simplest way to think about it. Now, the premise then is, okay, well, if I can build muscle in a deficit and a maintenance, why do I even need to consider a surplus? If that's going to put on body fat, why don't I just do it at maintenance? And why don't I just do it in a deficit if I still want to lose body fat? Now, it all comes back to, who are you as an individual? Who are you as a person? Where are you at in terms of your training age and your experience when it comes to training in the gym, building muscle, so on and so forth? If you are an absolute beginner who probably needs to lose a little bit of body fat first, then you naturally go into a deficit to lose that body fat. But the fact you are a beginner, the amount of training volume, the amount of stimulus you need to give your muscles in order for them to start growing is not that much. So you can start lifting, you can start pushing weight, whether that's machines, free weights, whatever. Even just having a vigorous wank will probably build up some gains of some description. So you really don't need to think about, okay, surplus and things like that. Yes, a surplus might be optimal, but if you need to lose a bit of body fat, again, you can probably build muscle in a deficit. Again, if you're in that scenario where you're relatively new, maintenance is also going to be an optimal way for you to build muscle. You're still going to be able to do it. You're going to be able to create the natural or the required amount of adaptations and training stimulus in order for your muscles to grow, provided you are backing that up with adequate protein intake and nutrition off the back of that. So surplus really becomes the go-to scenario for building muscle for someone who's more advanced, mainly because you want to, A, create that training stimulus. Now, that training stimulus is probably going to be a lot harder to achieve the more well-trained you are. Let's face it, you're going to need probably more volume. Your programming is going to be slightly more intense as you progress that over, let's say, a 12-week period. It's going to get progressively more challenging to keep challenging your muscles. So if you are in a deficit, for example, where energy availability is much, much lower, are you realistically going to be able to push as hard as you may be able to if you are in a calorie surplus? Can you really push the boundaries and the limits of where you can take things to from a hypertrophy point of view in order to build the most amount of muscle possible? The answer to that question is probably no. You're probably not going to be able to create the required stimulus in a deficit to build the most amount of muscle you possibly could. Now, obviously there's going to be people out there say, hey Simon, well, I'm advanced, I've been training for X amount of time and I'm absolutely fine, I can build a fuck ton of muscle, it doesn't apply to me. Cool, have at it. You might be one of the unique people that this doesn't apply to, but I'm talking to everybody else. So in that scenario, you've also then got to think about, okay, what is it that's going to about a surplus that's going to help me build muscle? So there is that like energy availability thing. Now, the other things that you've got to consider are there are a number of different functions associated with resistance training and building new muscle tissue that need to be accounted for, and that's where a calorie surplus can help. So let me list them off for you. I've got them written down right here. I'm going to list them out for you. So you've got to think about the energy stored within the muscle tissue itself. You've got to think about the energy cost of the resistance training itself. You've got to think about the elevation in post-training metabolism. You've got to think about the energy cost of building that new muscle and the subsequent metabolic functions that it may then kickstart. You've also maybe going to have to overcome a potential increase in your NEAT. So by that I mean when you are in a calorie deficit, we do know that metabolic adaptations do happen. That being that when you reduce your calorie intake, maybe your body down-regulates some of that function, you feel a little bit more lethargic, you naturally take less steps. A lot of people who have experienced a refeed will see that the NEAT may then go up, that spontaneous NEAT increase, driven by having more calories. So if you are in a calorie surplus, you're pushing hard in the gym, there's all of these different energy components that you need to think about. So potentially you need a surplus to account for all these things. So whether that's the building of new muscle, whether that's driving the training that's going to drive the adaptation, whether that is dealing with an increase in NEAT, which is going to increase energy expenditure, you're going to compensate for all these different things. But I would also say that this is not a calorie game. It is the case that when you're looking at fat loss, you can almost mathematically figure out how much body fat you can lose within a given period of time. For example, it takes, roughly speaking, 7,700 calories in order to burn through a kilo of body fat. So you can then say, well, if I put this amount of deficit in place every single day and stick to it consistently, then theoretically, all being equal, I should achieve X amount of weight loss in Y amount of time. Now, obviously, there's lots of things and variables that you are going to find difficult control to make that exact, but it puts you in the right ballpark. From a hypertrophy perspective and from a building muscle perspective, it's really not the same calorie game. And the science around having exact numbers of a calorie surplus to build the most amount of muscle is not really that well known. There's no specific number that you want to particularly be chasing, although we'll come on to some of those recommendations in a second. So the first thing that you want to think about with your surplus is you want to be consistent and you want it to be sustained. There's no real point in doing an acute calorie surplus. Like, I'm going to go in a calorie surplus for 2 days and then that's going to build me a shit ton of muscle because I had 2 hard workouts. It's kind of not going to work out like that. What you need is an extended period of time in a calorie surplus. Now, I would always kind of roughly ballpark, if you're going to do, say, for example, 1 month in a calorie deficit, you want to do at least 3 months in a calorie surplus. And that would be a way to start to, again, ballpark where you want to pitch how long you want to be in a surplus. Now, obviously that's going to change. That's going to be variable between person and between goal and where you're at and all those different sorts of things. But it may be a good start point for you to kickstart things from. Now, the other thing is that there was a recent study in 2019 coming out of Eric Helms and a few other people well known in the industry that looked at different calorie surpluses. And what they kind of boiled down to was that it's probably going to be most optimal for most people. Now, these are very precise numbers. To be in a calorie surplus that's between 358 to 478 calories per day. But that's hugely dependent on the person. It's hugely dependent on individual circumstances and individual scenarios. So you remember that they would have a set number of people within a study, for example, or any study that's carried out on a calorie surplus, for example, is going to take a set amount of people and they're going to put them through a specific protocol. Now, if your situation is slightly different, maybe you've got a higher level of NEAT, or maybe you're doing slightly more training sessions, or your training sessions are slightly longer or more intense. These things are all going to play as a factor into how much calorie surplus you actually need personally. So the real recommendation would probably be to start at something like 200 calories above your deficit. Above your maintenance, should I say. Let me not confuse you there. Now, what you would then do is say, right, okay, let's monitor this for 2 to 3 weeks. What happens with my average weight per week? Is it a case that I'm static and nothing is moving? You look at maybe pictures and body composition and other measurements and things like that. You don't see much change whatsoever. Probably suggests you're not really in that much of a surplus, or if any, because again, your energy expenditure is not going to be an exact science. You are going to fluctuate quite a lot. So it could be that you set this 200 calories surplus, but actually when you can't really factor in the fact that maybe you ballparked it at 10,000 steps per day was going to be your activity level, but some it's like 12,000, some it's like 15. Again, you might be drifting in and out of this surplus on a continual basis. So if that's kind of the scenario you're in, you're not seeing this movement in that 2 to 3 week period, then bump up another 200 calories or so. You might end up in that 358 to 478 sweet spot that they found in this particular study. You might have to have more. Again, it's about starting conservative with your surplus, because at the end of the day, you don't want to put on unnecessary body fat. I think when you get to sort of like 17-ish% body fat, which is very difficult to calculate unless you're having a DEXA scan, then you're not really going to, if you go over 17%, you may have some negative impacts around nutrient partitioning. You may be putting on a little bit more body fat than is actually necessary if you were to keep it below there. So there's that to consider. But in terms of your calorie surplus, really it's about setting that point that's right for you and starting conservative and working your way up. That's probably the best way that you can limit the amount of body fat that you put on when you go into that muscle building phase. Now, if you do favor that lower end, then again, don't be frightened to push that up if you aren't seeing results. Don't be frightened to keep assessing, reassessing, and kind of moving things forward. That's the way that you're going to get the most amount of progress possible if you want to be optimal and be in that surplus. So hopefully that kind of really summarized things for you in a nice, neat way in terms of this calorie surplus thing. So a surplus is probably optimal, especially if you are well trained, to build the most amount of muscle possible. Let's call it the metric fuck ton. Then from there, it's about figuring out what surplus is going to drive results for you and keep it as minimal as possible to achieve the maximum amount of results. Now, I would start with a 200 calorie surplus, monitor your weight, monitor your progress, and then adjust. If you need more, have more. If you need slightly less, have slightly less, but keep those adjustments moving. But don't shit the bed when it comes to your calorie surplus. Don't shit the bed after a week and your weight's gone up a little bit maybe, or after 2 weeks your weight's gone up a little bit. Don't shit the bed and go straight into a calorie deficit because you're panicked about putting on a little bit of body fat. If you do that, it's probably just not going to be conducive to achieving the results that you want. So that is a calorie surplus in a freaking nutshell.